Hey, Carlos, how's your week been?
It's good. It's crazy that it's March already, and it feels like spring is around the corner. So I'm feeling better. What about you?
Yeah, the flowers are coming out here in Washington after this long, long, long winter that we have had. I think we all need a little bit of sunshine and warmth and a few crocuses and daffodils to start to spring. And can I just say one other thing? That I have
Yes.
spent an awful lot of time this week thinking about and talking about the British royal family for obvious reasons. So I am super
Oh,
excited that we now get a chance to talk about something completely different.
you know what? It's about time. Although that was quite juicy, that interview this past week. But why don't we turn our attention?
Yeah, from Meghan and Harry to Bitcoin. Here we go. Hello, I'm Katty Kay in Washington.
And I'm Carlos Watson in California.
Welcome to When Katty Met Carlos.
A new podcast exploring what's shaping America today, brought to you by the BBC World Service and OZY Media.
Now, you may not understand exactly how it works, but chances are you've heard of it. Bitcoin is the world's first and most traded cryptocurrency, a digital form of money that relies on complex technology to make transactions. Bitcoin has gone up and down in price before, but it's surged in the last couple of months. And what's different this time is that big US companies suddenly seem to be taking the currency a lot more seriously. Citibank says digital currency is at a tipping point, and it could become the currency of choice for international trade. Bitcoin doesn't have a physical form. There are no actual coins. It's a virtual currency. To help us get our heads around what that means, here's the BBC's technology correspondent Rory Kethlen-Jones with a little primer.
In 2009, someone using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto published a plan for a new kind of money. He called it Bitcoin, and its unique feature was that it was decentralized, not created or controlled by a government or central bank. Instead, complex computer processes would mint new coins, and transactions would be recorded and confirmed using cryptography on an online ledger called a blockchain. Bitcoin was the first cryptocurrency. Many others have followed, and they all have one thing in common: extreme volatility, with prices surging up and down by more than 10% within hours. That has meant their little use as a means of exchange. Few businesses will accept a currency that may be worth a lot less tomorrow. True believers, who tend to be libertarians, will tell you that Bitcoin or its rivals will one day overturn the existing financial order. Skeptics point to the popularity of cryptocurrency with crooks and the vast amount of electricity needed to mint new coins.
Back in early 2011, one Bitcoin was worth roughly $1. 10 years later, a Bitcoin is worth around $50,000. But with great highs have come great lows. Along the way, the currency's value has also crashed in dramatic fashion. In the first month of this year alone, its value plummeted by some $9,000.
But one person who's been singing Bitcoin's praises is the tech billionaire Elon Musk. In February, his company Tesla bought $1.5 billion of the cryptocurrency, and that sent its value shooting up. It's since fallen, and Tesla's stock price has fallen even further.
But it's not just Elon Musk. In fact, in recent weeks, BNY Mellon, the nation's oldest bank, revealed its plans to manage Bitcoin just like any other asset. Politicians have also been taking notice. In fact, listen here to the mayor of Miami, Francis Suarez.
I want to thank the City of Miami Commissioners for supporting my resolution, which directs the city manager, after analysis, to procure a vendor to be able to offer our employees to get a percentage of their salary in Bitcoin, allows our residents to pay for fees in Bitcoin, and also would allow the city manager to cooperate with Miami-Dade County to allow for taxes to be paid in Bitcoin. It also request of the state legislature that the city of Miami supports efforts to make Bitcoin an acceptable currency for us to potentially invest in the future. It's wonderful to be a very crypto-forward city in the city of Miami, and I want to thank my commission colleagues for allowing that to happen.
So that's the view of the mayor of Miami, Francis Suarez. But in the federal government here in Washington, there are concerns. Here's Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen last month speaking at a New York Times conference.
So I don't think that Bitcoin, I've said this before, is widely used as a transaction mechanism. To the extent it's used, I fear it's often for illicit finance. It's an extremely inefficient way of conducting transactions, and the amount of energy that's consumed in processing those transactions is staggering. But it is a highly speculative asset, and I think people should beware. It's can be extremely volatile, and I do worry about potential losses that investors in it could suffer.
So Bitcoin, is it here to stay? And if so, how's it going to change our world? Our first guest, Lily Liu, is an entrepreneur. She first came across Bitcoin in 2013 and has been involved in cryptocurrency ever since. Lily, what was it about cryptocurrencies and perhaps Bitcoin in particular that first interested you?
Well, I started hearing about it during kind of the first bull market, if you will, in 2013. At the time, I was living in China, and a couple of things piqued my interest. There's a lot of press then, as there is now, and I thought, all right, this is either a huge scam or it's really sort of very revolutionary. So I read the white paper. I didn't fully understand it, I'm going to be honest, when I first read it, because I'm not a computer scientist. But it did seem very interesting to me that there would be this kind of decentralized form of money. And I started to really think about the possibilities. And at the time, I was living in China, having spent 3 years as CFO of a China-based company. And so I also experienced on a daily basis the difficulties of international finance, international trade, capital controls. And that was also where it really sort of pushed me to learn more about it.
And so then you became CFO, Lily, of a company that initially worked to generate new Bitcoins before developing it into one that monetized emails with cryptocurrency. And I think if I understand correctly, you sold it for more than $100 million at the time to Coinbase. How unusual were you even a couple of years ago when you were doing this?
We've been kind of outcasts, degenerates for a long time. And the Bitcoin industry has always been very interesting to me from the beginning because it always attracted such a wide spectrum of individuals. And even today, you see some of really the foremost minds in, for example, Silicon Valley having a deep interest and a long-term kind of commitment to cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, and some really brilliant computer scientists and engineers. And then on the other hand, you also do have folks who are really just in for the speculative ride. And, people have also certainly made a career in various forms out of that. And so it really is a very, very wide spectrum of people. It really cuts across so many different demographics.
Lily, I'm very glad to hear you say that you didn't understand it when you first read the white paper about it. That makes me feel an awful lot better about myself because it's something I've always tried to get my head around too. Stay with us, Lily. Our next guest is the author of Digital Gold, Bitcoin and the Inside Story of the Misfits and Millionaires Trying to Reinvent Money. As a technology reporter for the New York Times, Nathaniel Popper has been following the Bitcoin story for nearly a decade. So, Nathaniel, obviously, people have heard of Bitcoin. It's had its ups and downs. There does seem to be something different about the surge that we've seen in the last couple of months, or the movements we've seen in the last couple of months. What is it that's different this time?
You're right. I think there is, as is often said, something different this time. Bitcoin has been through a long series of bubbles. Every few years, you see this pattern where the price shoots up and then sometime shortly thereafter falls down pretty dramatically. And when it has happened in the past, I think what you've seen is that you've gotten, it shot up because ordinary people in some part of the world. In 2013, it was actually people in China found out about this and started pushing up the price. And it felt like a sort of easily accessible online casino. And I think the underlying technology wasn't really there to support all of that use. And also I think the position of governments wasn't clear. And so as people piled in, they piled out just as quickly. What you're seeing this time is that over the years, the number of serious institutions and serious programmers getting involved has grown. Each of these bubbles has brought in a new group of serious entrepreneurs and programmers who have worked on sort of creating the infrastructure for Bitcoin and also creating the sort of intellectual argument for Bitcoin. And so where we are now is that you actually have sort of an underlying system to support companies like Tesla putting $1.5 billion into this.
Yeah, and it's not just Tesla. I mean, during 2020, we saw PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, BNY Mellon kind of all getting involved in and making it look more respectable is the wrong word. Making it seem more concrete, more like, as Citi has said, it's at a tipping point. Do you think we can all say now that after what happened last year, Bitcoin is here to stay, and it has the potential to become a currency of international trade?
Well, I think that it is as here to stay as most technologies and even currencies are. I mean, what Bitcoin has reminded us, the world, is that money is really a sort of social creation. It's something that works because we believe in it. And Bitcoin works because more and more people have come to believe in it. I mean, a dollar, a pound is not actually backed up by anything. So you have to believe, with a normal currency, you have to believe in the promises of the government that's backing it up. And those governments have proven to be generally good stewards of their currencies. And so people have kept that confidence and are willing to hold on to it, even though it's not actually backed up by anything. With Bitcoin, you have something similar. I mean, it's not backed up by something, but people have come to believe that the sort of underlying infrastructure works, and that this idea, there's a whole lot of economic ideas behind it, but that they will work. I mean, I think unlike the dollar and the pound, there is software here and there's cryptography here that could still be proven vulnerable. That could happen. But and if it does happen, I think, Bitcoin could crash. If suddenly somebody figures out how to spend, the same Bitcoin in two places, that would really kill confidence in this. But each year it exists with hackers going after it. I mean, you have the best hackers in the world trying to break into this system, and they haven't succeeded for, 12 years now. And so, that gives you reason to think that they're probably not going to. But it has a vulnerability that I think the dollar, and other national currencies don't have.
So fast forward for me. What is the point at which an average person here in the U.S. might start to interact with that? Give someone a vision of what could be 5 years out.
I mean, with Bitcoin, so far, it's actually a pretty simple argument. It's not that this is some programmable money that you're going to buy everything with. What Bitcoin is today, what most people are investing in, is the idea of a sort of scarce commodity like gold. And so just as people have piled, I don't know where we are, something like $9 trillion into gold, maybe it's more than that, because it's a place you can keep your money outside of the government where the supply is controlled, that idea with gold has drawn a lot of people. And if Bitcoin gets to be as attractive as gold, there are all these calculations out there that each Bitcoin would be worth, $200,000, $500,000. So there's that simple argument for Bitcoin, and that still may be where it is in 5 years.
So Lily, let me put the same question to you. It's 2026. Are we going around buying things with Bitcoins?
I think Bitcoin is actually a little bit different from kind of rest of cryptocurrency. And so to your question, how are we going to see Bitcoin sort of get into the everyday lives of folks? I think that in the next 5 years, it's mostly going to be seen as an investment asset, a bit of an alternative to gold. And that can
So an investment more than a currency?
Yes, I think more of an investment than a currency for Bitcoin, because that is, the kind of bedrock argument for Bitcoin is being embraced by institutions, which are sort of backing Bitcoin now with a lot of confidence.
But with companies like PayPal now supporting Bitcoin, do you think there is the potential for it to become more part of our life, given that we all buy things online anyway?
I think so. Certainly the infrastructure will be in place so it's more accessible, whereas previously it was folks were definitively deciding not to support it. Now there's support for it. But I think then a number of folks, if they believe that Bitcoin is going to be, $200,000, $500,000 one day, I think you'll actually see a number of people choose not to spend it because, they feel like it's going to 10x, right? So there's all sorts of sort of new payment models that you can envision, new types of transactions you can enable when you have sort of a much more fuller featured digital first currency. And Bitcoin is the first one of those. But there's, certainly a wealth of projects innovating in that space.
So, Nathaniel, talk a little bit about maybe some of the geographical differences. What have you observed so far about the potential global differences in Bitcoin usage and uptake?
Yeah. There's, when I was writing my book and since then, I've visited a number of different countries, including China, Argentina, Iceland, Europe. Where, I've looked at how people are using Bitcoin, and the ideas around Bitcoin are very different in different places. And that's one of the most amazing things about Bitcoin. And one of the most amazing things about having this anonymous creator. You don't have a person there to define what it is. And so each person can sort of define it for themselves. And a country can sort of define it for itself. It has a certain use and a certain set of ideas in one place that it doesn't somewhere else. So in places like Argentina and Venezuela, you have people who have confronted currencies that have been declining in value or where there's a history of hyperinflation. And so the idea that they could get this thing online that the government can't stop them from getting, where their money might be able to keep its value better than the local currency, has been a very sort of easy sell. And one of the most interesting things is, the United States is one of the places where it's taken off first, but it's actually the place where it's the least needed. People already have access to digital finance. People have access to a pretty reliable currency. And I think really a lot of the strongest arguments for Bitcoin are coming from other countries. And in fact, in many other countries, people sort of understand it more intuitively, whereas in the United States and Europe, where currencies work, it's tended to be more the libertarians with anti-government sentiment who are drawn to it. So in each place, you see a different argument. And in China, just to throw this in there, in China, you have a situation where the government could easily seize your bank account or has very strong capital controls, as Lily was putting on. So you can't move your money in and out of the country as you'd want to, and as you can in the United States. And so in China, it has this very practical use for people who say, I want a bank account where the government can't just sort of dip into it or make rules when they want to.
Lily, that gets me then on to China. And China is rolling out its own digital currency, a digital yuan. In a sense, doesn't that kind of undercut the whole notion that Nathaniel was just talking about, that this is decentralized, no one controls it, governments can't interfere with it? If China's now going to produce its own digital currency, that argument for cryptocurrency goes, doesn't it?
That's quite interesting what they're doing because, China is very technologically oriented because they see technology as a way of accelerating their global ambitions, right? I think there's many, many strategic reasons, both domestic and international, why China is developing this with great interest, and it has been for a number of years now. I think domestically, one is that digital payments is already just a way of life in China. But that's controlled by two very powerful companies. Those are not the government's own servers. They don't have full control over the user base. So the digital yuan helps cement that control and kind of re-centralize power over the daily spending habits of hundreds of millions of people. And that's very, very much in line with the goals of a centralized government, such as in China. So it actually provides very fine-grained control for various types of regulation. And that is really what I think is coming down the pipe.
Nathaniel, so how much of a threat is something like the digital yuan to U.S. financial strength?
I think they're really two very different questions. I think on the Chinese front, I think part of the reason China is doing this is because the United States and the US dollar is so far ahead. And that's why the US isn't doing this. I mean, the US is sitting in the pole position way far ahead of anybody else. I mean, the dollar is the dominant currency. And so there's very little reason to take a risk that might do any damage to that. I think if, the ECNY, if the Chinese digital currency works, it'll put more pressure on the United States to eventually follow. But, this is really, China is doing this in a sense from a position of weakness. But I think, with Bitcoin, it's a different question. And I think a lot of this conversation, goes back to the confusion that's caused by Bitcoin being referred to as a virtual currency. It's really, in many senses, just not a currency. You can, meet some of the qualities, but it's not trying to challenge the dollar. It is a challenge to gold right now. And so it can do certain things that the dollar can do. You can do illegal transactions. You can buy drugs online, which is much harder with the dollar. So it does serve certain purposes as a currency. But it's really, people get confused. And I'll say, PayPal, the CEO of PayPal seems to be confused about this. The CEO of Uber seems to be confused about this. They all say, we're going to introduce Bitcoin payments. And it's like, nobody uses Bitcoin for payments. How did you not get this in your research, PayPal? It's an investment, but in many ways people get confused because it's referred to as a currency. And the reality is that's not the argument for it anymore. So in that sense, it's a challenge to US national security because terrorists can move money around, but I don't think it's a challenge to the dollar necessarily.
Nathaniel, I'm interested that you mentioned gold there because it does seem to me that the analogy is less with a currency and more with gold. And we know historically that people have invested in gold at times of risk when they feel anxious about the world or anxious about the world's financial system. To what extent do you think that the excitement then about Bitcoin that we've seen during the course of 2020 is linked to the global pandemic? Or am I extrapolating here?
No, absolutely. It's not everything. There are a lot of other factors here in terms of companies, the kind of stability of the infrastructure and the companies that support it. But, this really began, if you look at the price of Bitcoin, this march up began in March 2020. And at first when the pandemic hit, price of Bitcoin fell pretty sharply, but very quickly thereafter, it began climbing. And, there's a whole lot of reasons for that. People realizing, with the pandemic that our lives are increasingly digital, we're making payments online, we're doing everything more on the internet. This makes more sense. But then there's this whole argument, and this is what a lot of companies are saying, which is that governments, monetary policy, they're just printing money to support, pandemic relief. And that there's just the sense out there that's going to have to hurt the dollar. Your dollar sitting in your bank account has become less valuable. And so I would rather have my money somewhere where it can't be inflated like that. I think, there's an economic argument about how much inflation there is with the dollar. But that is a very widespread belief that has driven adoption this year.
Nathaniel Popper, Lily Liu, thank you both for a spectacular conversation. Really, Katty and I both really enjoyed this, and we look forward to speaking to you both again.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Katty, so what did you think?
Well, I just felt that I learned a ton about Bitcoin, about its future, about this difference between it being an investment and a currency, which is something I think I had never really understood, about what China is doing, about the fact that we should be looking to Venezuela, that I had not realized. So super interesting and clearly a subject where there is a lot happening and happening quite fast right at the moment. So very timely.
I also think it'll be a beginning of reimagining all sorts of fundamental things. If you start to reimagine something that probably many folks, certainly in the US and the UK, take for granted, which is currency, you can start reimagining all sorts of things. How do you think about the power of a state? How do you think about enforcement and laws? It was really quite an interesting conversation, not only about Bitcoin itself, but about its potential larger implications.
Yeah, I thought what Nathaniel said actually early on in the conversation was something I hadn't really thought about, which is basically money is trust.
Right.
Whatever that money is, whether it's a Bitcoin, a dollar bill, an egg, a piece of stone that is traded, it all relies on trust. And what is happening now is more people are trusting that Bitcoin is here to stay. And in a way, that de facto makes it an important part of our financial system. And it's great. This is why I love you being on the West Coast and me being on the East Coast, because as we heard from Janet Yellen right at the top of the program, the Treasury Secretary, there is in establishment regulatory circles still hesitancy about Bitcoin. And I get a sense that out on the West Coast, and not just on the West Coast, I mean, I think what Nathaniel said, that a lot of people around the world in countries with currencies that are volatile or that have governments that can intervene in their currencies in ways that are capricious, in those countries, people are very excited about Bitcoin. On the West Coast, they're very excited about Bitcoin. And perhaps here in Washington, people in the more establishment areas of finance and regulatory areas of finance, they're the ones that are perhaps a little bit behind the curve.
Well, the disruptors are clearly at the gate, and it feels like in so many different ways, in politics and sport, and increasingly in business and currency, whether it's GameStop or whether it's Bitcoin or other things. Katty, something tells me we are going to have a lot to talk about this year. I don't think this is going to be a quiet year after all.
No, the year of the disruptor.
Yeah. Oh, I kind of like that. It could be good.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of When Katty Met Carlos, a co-production from the BBC World Service
and OZY Media. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review, tell a friend, and of course, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you, and we'll be back soon.